Welcome and thank you for tuning in. Today we're going to be working on our first flipped lesson. What's going to happen is I'm going to be showing you how to do a few things. Automatically the video is going to stop and ask you a few questions. Please try to answer these questions as accurately as possible. So that way I can get an idea of what you are understanding and what you're not understanding. On that note, let's just go ahead and get started. So for our very first example here, it says there's been a reflection over the y-axis. So the couple things that we need to remember about reflection. Number one, reflection preserves size. And number two, reflection also preserves shape. So what that means is the two shapes we have here are congruent. And because these shapes are congruent, we know a few things. We know that corresponding sides are going to be congruent and corresponding angles are congruent. Now it's going to be our job to identify what those corresponding angles are and what those corresponding side lengths are. So let's just go ahead and get started and look at the image to see what we know. So here, just by looking at it, I can tell that angle X is going to be congruent to angle G. So notice I give it a little arc, okay? This is going to be a quick way for me to see what angles are congruent to which angle. So I'm going to say angle X is congruent to angle G. What else? Angle Y is congruent to angle H. So now, instead of putting one tick mark, I'm going to put two, because if I only put one, then it's going to be a little bit confusing. I'm not going to know which one tick mark is congruent to the other tick mark. So that's what I'm going to do and say that angle Y is congruent to angle H. And last but not least, angle Z will therefore be congruent to angle F. So notice I put 3 tick marks this time so that I know the difference between all 3 angles. So let's write angle Z is congruent to angle F. So that now that I know which corresponding angles are congruent, I also know what corresponding sides are congruent. So what can I do now? Well, let's take a look. To me, it looks like they're right triangles, so I'm just going to refer to them as legs and the hypotenuse. I'm going to say the short leg is congruent to the short leg. So I'm going to say segment YZ. And the way we denote a segment is putting a bar right above it, is congruent to, now here's where it's very important. Since I said YZ, I must say HF. If I go the other way, then it's technically wrong. You need to make sure the corresponding letters match up. So I'm going to say YZ is congruent to HF. Okay, got that. What else? Let's see, the hypotenuse is congruent to the hypotenuse. So I'm going to say XY is congruent to GH. So XY is congruent to GH. So notice, since I went from the top to the bottom, I had to repeat the same on the other side, from top to bottom. And last but not least, the longer leg, so XZ, I'm going to give it 3 tick marks, is congruent to the longer leg here, so it's GF, and again, that requires 3 tick marks. So XZ is congruent to GF. So you're probably wondering, is there another way I can do this? Is there something more simple? The answer is yes, that's what I'm here for. So what I'm going to show you now is how you can write a congruent statement and how that congruent statement can give you all this information really quick and really easy. So here, I'm going to go ahead and write a statement that proves this triangle is congruent to that triangle. So I'm going to say triangle XYZ. The first one, it does not matter how you order it. I could have said ZYX if I wanted to, doesn't matter. However, this next statement that says it's congruent to does matter. Corresponding points need to match up. So since I said X, Y, Z, I'm going to have to say GHF. So I have GHF. Now, why is this important? Well, because of this, you're going to notice there's going to be a connection between the corresponding angles that are congruent and the corresponding sides that are congruent. Take a look. Here it says angle X and angle G are congruent. The first letter and the first letters are congruent. Okay. So here it says angle Y is congruent to angle H. So the second letter is congruent to the second letter. Interesting. And the last one, angle Z is congruent to angle F. The third letter is congruent to the third letter. So notice here, because of this, I don't even need a picture anymore. If I know this one statement, I can technically figure out which corresponding angles are congruent. Same thing here. YZ, so second and third letter is congruent to the second and third letter, HF. XY, first and second is congruent to the first and second. Here, XZ, so first and last, is congruent to first and last. So notice, now that I know a congruent statement, I don't even need a picture anymore. I can just go ahead and give my congruent statement and then figure out what the corresponding angles are congruent and which corresponding sides are congruent. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and give you another example. And this time, we're just going to use a congruent statement to figure out which corresponding angles are congruent and which corresponding sides are congruent. So let's give it a shot. So now we have our second example. This time it says that we have a 90-degree counterclockwise rotation. So the one thing we need to remember about rotation is it preserves size and shape. So we know for a fact these two shapes are congruent. So let's go ahead and get started with writing a congruent statement. I am going to say triangle, and here again the order does not matter. I'm just going to go ahead and put ABC is congruent to, now here the order is going to matter. Since I chose A, B, C, it went from the middle length to the short length. I'm going to have to go middle to short. So I'm going to say this is congruent to F, D, E. Here, the statement is very important again. If you make any mistake here, all of your answers that follow are going to be incorrect as well. So before you get started, please make sure this is correct. So again, middle, short, long, so ABC. So again, it's middle, short, long. It looks good. So now from that, I can determine which angles are congruent. So I'm going to say angle A is congruent to, well, first is congruent to first, so that's angle F. So I'm going to mark that as angle A and angle F. Now angle B, the second one, is congruent to the second one here, is congruent to angle D. I'm going to go ahead and annotate that. Angle B, this time I put 2 tick marks, is congruent to D. That looks pretty good so far. I'm going to keep going. Last one is the angle C is congruent to angle E. And I'm going to annotate that as well. So this time there's 3 tick marks. E is congruent to C and vice versa. Now that we have our angles, we can go ahead and move on to the side lengths. So there I can now say, let's see, AB, the first and second, are congruent to the FD, which is first and second. So AB is congruent to FD. So let's annotate that. AB is congruent to FD. That looks about right. Let's move over to the second and third. So BC is congruent to the second and third, which is DE. I'm going to annotate that with 2 tick marks this time. BC is congruent to DE. And last but not least, wait a second, I can't shift anymore. So here's the trick. You pick the first and the last term. So I'm going to say AC is congruent to first and last FE. Let's see if that looks about right. AC, yep, is congruent to FE. Awesome. So now that's it. We're done. We went ahead and identified the corresponding angles that are congruent and the corresponding sides that are congruent. Okay, so now we're on our third example. So now instead of 3 sides, we have 4. And to be quite honest, it could be a little bit tricky. So here's what I'm going to suggest to you. This is what I would do. Because it's a little bit tricky, what I'm going to do is kind of turn my head to kind of get an idea of what the shapes are going to look like. So right now, what I'm envisioning is a shape that looks like this. This is the shape that I want to go off of. So if I kind of turn my head to see what that shape is going to look like, I'm going to call the quadrilateral, let's see, starting from this point, I'm going to call it P, T, R, K. So I went from here, P, T, R, K. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process. I'm going to start at this point here, which is going to correspond to this point, and it's going to go this way. So it's going to go J, X, Y, whoops, Y, E. So I'm going to go ahead and put that is congruent to quadrilateral J, X, Y, E. I know it looks a little silly that you gotta turn your head, but it's definitely helpful. And definitely starting with a point shape like this and establishing this is where I'm going to start is going to be very helpful as well. Because now that I have this, I'm pretty confident I got this. I could write my congruence statement. I can say angle P is congruent to angle J. Let's just double check that real quick and erase all of this messiness and see what we have. So angle P is congruent to angle J. That looks about right. Okay, angle T, so the second one is congruent to angle X, which is also the second one. Let's see, T, putting 2 tick marks this time, and X. So far, it's still looking good. Now the third one, angle R, is congruent to the third one, which is angle Y. So R, congruent to Y, still looks good. And last but not least, angle, fourth one, which is K, is congruent to the fourth one, which is angle E. So K, 1, 2, 3, 4, is congruent to E, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that looks good. So now that we have that, we have to move over to the side legs. So I'm going to have to say the first two, so PT is congruent to the first two, which is JX. And I'm going to go ahead and annotate that for you just so that we can see PT and JX. That looks good. And I'm going to suggest that you do this as you go along because you'll never know if you accidentally made a mistake. If you kind of look as you go along, you're going to be able to say, okay, so things are looking good. I'm good. But if something goes wrong, that means your congruent statement is incorrect. You've got to go back. Okay, continuing on, now we're going to do second and third. So I'm going to say segment TR is congruent to second and third, which is X and Y. Let's annotate that. So TR, going to put 2 tick marks this time, and XY. Yep, that looks about right. Okay, next one is going to be third and fourth. So segment RK is congruent to third and fourth, which is Y and E. So this time I'm going to annotate that with 3 tick marks. So RK is congruent to YE. And that looks about right as well. It's the longest length. And last but not least, here, since there's no more to move, we're going to do first and last. So we're going to say segment PK is congruent to first and last, which is J and E. And again, let's double check that. PK, which is going to have 4 tick marks this time, is congruent to JE. And that looks about right to me. So again, just a quick reminder, the tick marks looks a little bit intimidating, but this is going to be a quick way for you to identify JX is congruent to TP, okay? But technically it's JX. Yeah, that sounds about right. So now that is it. You're going to answer a few more questions, and once you've done that, you are done. You completed the homework. Thank you for trying this, and until next time, bye.